At 29 years old, Sarah earns more than her parents did at the same age. She did everything she was told to do. University, a full-time job, years of savings. Yet the house she wanted to buy last year now costs another $90,000. She isn't alone. Across Australia, millions are asking the same question. What happened to the Australian dream? Australia consistently ranks among the world's most livable countries. Yet for millions of young Australians, the idea of owning a home feels further away than it has in living memory. Sydney is now the second most unaffordable major housing market on Earth. Only Hong Kong is worse. How did one of the world's wealthiest nations arrive here? This is the Anglosphere economy. Episode 1, Australia. Begin with the numbers, because they are stark enough to need no embellishment. As of February 2026, the national median dwelling value in Australia was $922,838, according to Catality. The national median multiple, median house price divided by median household income, is 8.2. In Sydney, it's 10.1. Adelaide, 9.5. Brisbane, 9.1. Anything above 5.0 is classified severely unaffordable by international standards. Every major Australian city now exceeds that threshold by a significant margin. 3 years ago, 43% of median income households could afford the median-priced home. Today, according to PropTrack, that figure is 14%. Wait, Australians now need 11 years to save a 20% deposit. Yet during those same 11 years, the house they're saving for often becomes even more expensive than the savings they've accumulated. For every year spent saving, the price increase often adds more to the required deposit than the saving achieved that year. Home ownership among young Australians has fallen from 61% in 1981 to 43% in the 2021 census, and the trajectory into 2026 suggests it's now closer to 40. These are not projections. This is what has already happened. To understand why, you have to understand what home ownership meant to Australia in the first place. 1948. Government-built housing and cheap land release begin transforming Australian cities. 1955. Home ownership rates climbed toward the highest in the developed world. 1965. The quarter-acre block becomes not a privilege, but an assumption, something owed to anyone in steady work. 1980. That assumption still holds for most Australians entering the workforce. 2026. It does not hold for the generation buying now. That achievement became part of Australian identity. It has not survived intact to the present day. Why not? Economists agree on almost nothing about housing policy. But they agree on this. There is no single cause. Start with supply. The National Housing Accord, a 2024 agreement between federal, state, and local governments, set a target of 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. By March 2026, Australia was 112,365 dwellings behind that pace. The Productivity Commission found this year that it now takes roughly twice as long to complete a house as it did 30 years ago, attributed to a slower approval process, a fragmented construction industry dominated by small players, and persistent difficulty attracting skilled workers. Annual completions are running at roughly 165,000 to 190,000 homes, against an estimated need of around 240,000 a year. That gap does not close quickly. Every year it persists, adds to a shortfall the next year inherits. Unfortunately, building too few homes wasn't the whole story. Australia's net overseas migration is forecast to exceed 300,000 in the current financial year. Population growth and housing supply have been moving in opposite directions for long enough that the gap between them has become structural, not cyclical. But, and this is the point most public debate skips, demand alone does not explain the price level, and supply alone does not either. If supply were the only constraint, prices would rise in line with the shortfall and no faster. If demand were the only driver, cheap credit alone would explain the entire story. Neither is true. It is the interaction that matters, and cheap credit is where that interaction becomes visible most clearly. Interest rates make borrowing capacity elastic in ways that directly translate into prices. AMP's analysis puts a number on this. Each quarter-point cut in the cash rate adds roughly $11,000 to how much an average earner can borrow, which flows almost directly into what they can offer for a home. The RBA cut rates 3 times in 2025, taking the cash rate to 3.6%. Prices responded. The National Home Value Index rose 8.6% over the year, adding roughly $71,400 to the median dwelling value. Then in 2026, the RBA reversed course, hiking in February, March, and May, taking the cash rate to 4.35%, unwinding the previous year's cuts entirely. Every time borrowing capacity expands, it does not primarily buy more houses. It bids up the price of the houses that already exist. Now the tax debate, the part of this story that generates the most political heat, and where we will present both sides without taking one. For decades, Australia's tax system allowed investors to deduct losses on a rental property against their other income. Negative gearing, combined with a 50% discount on capital gains tax, introduced in 1999. The argument for this system, it encouraged investment that added to rental supply, and taxing capital gains at a discount reflected that much of a nominal gain is simply inflation, not real wealth creation. The argument against a Senate committee that reported in March 2026 found evidence that the combination had shifted housing ownership away from owner-occupiers and toward investors, with real consequences for intergenerational equity. In May 2026, the federal government acted. The budget abolished negative gearing for established residential properties purchased after budget night from July 2027, while preserving it for new builds to keep the tax incentive pointed at adding supply. The 50% capital gains discount is being replaced with cost-based indexation and a 30% minimum tax on real gains, also from July 2027. Existing investments are grandfathered. Nothing changes for property already held. Economists are divided on the effect. Some argue this will genuinely redirect investor capital away from competing with first-home buyers. Others, including economist Solace Lake, note the changes may simply make property relatively less attractive compared to shares, without necessarily freeing up existing stock quickly, since grandfathered investors have little incentive to sell. This is the largest reform to Australian property taxation in nearly 3 decades. Its effects will not be visible for years. Who benefits from the system as it has existed? Existing homeowners have seen the value of their largest asset rise substantially. Investors, until this year's reform, captured a tax structure explicitly designed to reward leveraged property ownership. Banks earn from a mortgage book that has grown in lockstep with prices. State governments earn stamp duty that rises automatically with prices, without them lifting a finger. Superannuation funds hold substantial property exposure, meaning millions of Australians who will never own an investment property are still financially exposed to the market's performance through their retirement savings. Who pays? Renters facing a median weekly rent that has climbed towards $681 nationally, with vacancy rates near historic lows. First-home buyers, competing not just against other buyers, but against 11 years of accumulated deposit-saving math working against them. Essential workers in high-cost cities, teachers, nurses, police, increasingly unable to live near where they work. Regional communities, some of which have seen investor and lifestyle-driven demand push prices up faster than local wages can follow, and an entire generation for whom the assumption that underpinned Australian identity for 70 years no longer reliably holds. Is this uniquely Australian? No. And understanding why not matters for what comes next. Since 1994, using OECD price-to-income data, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom have all seen that ratio rise by more than 80%. The United States saw a 20% rise over the same period, real but far smaller. New Zealand's ratio rose 126% between 1994 and 2021, before falling back roughly 46 points by 2024. That New Zealand reversal is worth examining closely because it is the strongest available evidence on what actually changes this dynamic. In 2016, Auckland substantially reformed its residential zoning rules, permitting significantly denser housing, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, across most of the city's residential land. A study published in the Journal of Urban Economics found that construction permits doubled within 5 years of the reform, and that rents in upzoned areas ended up 26 to 33% lower than they would otherwise have been. That is not a modeling exercise. It is an observed before and after comparison from a real English-speaking city that shares much of Australia's planning history. Canada offers a different comparison. Its house price to income ratio has followed a broadly similar trajectory to Australia's. But Canadian apartment construction has moved in the opposite direction. Unit commencements up 71% since 2016, compared with Australian apartment starts down 48% over roughly the same period. The most credible explanation is a revived purpose-built rental sector, backed by deliberate federal financing, that Australia has not matched at the same scale. Can Australia fix this? Every credible answer starts the same way, not with any single lever. Planning reform, faster, simpler approvals, is already partially underway. The federal government committed $45 million in the 2026 budget to a single-touch approval process. Infrastructure funding, the new $2 billion local infrastructure fund, is intended to unlock land that currently sits undeveloped because roads, water, and power aren't in place. Tax reform, already underway, as described, though its effects remain unmeasured. Migration settings. Some economists argue Australia should follow Canada's lead in moderating net overseas migration, while others argue the supply response is the more tractable lever. Construction productivity, a problem that predates any single policy cycle and will likely require sustained reform across state planning systems. There is no single solution because there was no single cause. The skeptic's challenge. First, are house prices really the core problem, or is income growth the bigger issue? This documentary does not resolve it. Both price growth and wage stagnation have contributed, and reasonable analysts weight them differently. Second, could some proposed solutions make things worse? Removing negative gearing on established properties could, in the near term, reduce rental supply if investors hold rather than sell, precisely the lock-in effect several analysts have flagged. Third, is this an Australian story or an Anglosphere story? The OECD data suggests the latter. Australia, Canada, and the UK have moved in close to lockstep since 1994. This is not primarily a story about Australian mismanagement. It is a story about what happens across English-speaking property markets that share broadly similar planning traditions, tax structures, and migration-driven growth models. What we know, prices have risen far faster than wages for 2 decades. Supply has consistently fallen short of targets. Interest rate cycles translate directly into price movements. And the tax system has, until this year, incentivized investor ownership over first home buyers. What remains uncertain, whether the May 2026 tax reforms will free up existing housing stock or simply reduce its attractiveness relative to other assets. Whether construction productivity can improve fast enough to close a structural shortfall. What Australians should watch, whether apartment and townhouse construction data starts to resemble Canada's post-2016 trajectory or continues Australia's recent decline. Every generation inherits a different Australia. One inherited cheap land, one inherited high wages, one inherited rising property wealth. Today's generation has inherited the highest barrier to home ownership in modern Australian history. Whether that changes may become one of the defining political and economic questions of the next decade. Because housing isn't simply about property, it's about opportunity, family, stability, and whether the promise of the Australian dream still exists. I'm the Anglosphere Report, connecting the stories shaping the Anglosphere and the world. If housing is becoming less affordable across Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Britain at the same time. Are these separate national problems or part of a much bigger Anglosphere story?